Hello everybody, I'm Ajit K. Mishra, your course instructor for literature and coping skills. I'm back with another lecture, and this time I'm going to talk about decision-making anxiety. If you remember, in my last lecture I talked about death anxiety, and I also showed how with the help of a literary composition we can develop certain skills and strategies and we can take care of our death anxiety. Similarly, this time I'm also going to talk about decision-making anxiety, and I have chosen a literary composition, a poetic text, with the help of which I'm going to show you how we can develop certain coping skills or strategies in order to take care of our decision-making anxiety. So we all know decision-making is not an easy process. The moment we are told that we are to make a decision, we are visited by a great amount of anxiety. There are certain decisions that do not have serious consequences, but the moment you realize, you are aware that your decision is going to have serious consequences, you begin to experience anxiety. That's perfectly fine, because that particular experience of anxiety will let you know that you're serious about that particular thing. You're serious about your decision. So today I'm going to talk about decision-making anxiety and its various facets one by one, and I'll walk you through each one of those elements in today's lecture. So we'll start with the idea of decision-making, and then we'll move to the prefrontal cortex and decision-making. I'll show you the role of PFC in decision-making process, and then we'll come to a very interesting concept, the paradox of choice, which in fact leads to a great amount of decision-making in us. And then we'll come to the idea of decision-making anxiety, and then I'll take up The Road Not Taken, a poetic text composed by Robert Frost, an American poet. And I'll show you how the speaker in that poem in fact shows certain wonderful coping skills and strategies that we can also emulate, and we can fill our storehouse of coping skills. And then I'll be focused on specific coping strategies that are used in The Road Not Taken, and then we'll get to know how these coping strategies can be extremely helpful in similar situations. So let's take a quick look at each of these elements. But before I do so, let me tell you that decision making is such a regular everyday activity that we cannot evade it. We all make decisions. Researchers feel that humans make as much as 3,000 decisions every day, starting with the decision of picking a glass of water, to picking your pen, writing something, dressing yourself, taking baths, and a variety of things. So the decision-making process is an ongoing process. It never stops. But the problem arises the moment we know that our decision will lead to some kind of consequence. Then we certainly become aware and conscious of it, and then we experience anxiety. So fearing the decision-making process is not abnormal, but developing anxiety over the decision-making process for a certain period of time is, of course, a clinical condition. So we'll take a look at each of these ideas. But before we talk about decision making, you need to stop and think for a while. Take a look at this quote, and as you go through this quote, wherever you make a big decision in life, at least any decision where you have a viable alternative, there is an inevitable uneasy aftermath. Anxiety is merely a sign that you are taking something seriously. So there are two very important things that have been suggested in this quote. The first is, whenever you know that you have a viable alternative and you are asked to make a decision in life especially, that will create a huge amount of anxiety in you. But then at the same time, you also need to be aware of the fact that your anxiety is a sign that you are taking that particular decision-making activity seriously. So this decision-making process has both the sides. So it can lead to problems and it can also lead to rewards. So therefore, we need to think about it seriously. Emily Griffin, American author, has very rightly suggested that decision making becomes extremely difficult when we have viable options or viable alternatives right in front of us, and that is bound to lead to anxiety. So it's not abnormal or unnatural to experience anxiety when it comes to decision making. So decision making, it's a cognitive process. We all know the executive brain functions. The prefrontal cortex becomes extremely active in the decision-making process. And whenever we make a choice between a number of possible alternatives. So, for you, it's important to understand the implications of the idea of choice. So, it's the idea of choice that makes it or renders it difficult. Because choice is a result of freedom. When we know that I'm free to make a choice, make a decision, I'll certainly like that. We all want to be free. We all want to have a great amount of freedom. But then, if you think about it from a different perspective, or at the hindsight, you'll get to know that that particular freedom, which gives us the choice to decide or do things on our own, in fact comes with a baggage of responsibility. It makes us responsible for our choices, which are the result of the freedom that we enjoy. So therefore, decision making, which is a result of the freedom of choice, leads to the idea of responsibility and thus to the result of anxiety, because it results in anxiety. So that's a very complex process, but we need to understand it. And then we all know that the decision making process involves risks, rewards and consequences. It can have risk. We all know that very, very well. So your decision might be a risky proposition. You know that. It will lead to risks. It may also lead to rewards. You never know, because you've not seen the consequences that lies in the future, and we cannot see that. And then it can have serious consequences as well. It can lead to severe problems. So that's decision making. It's not an easy task. And then decision making depends on the proper functioning of the specific neurons within the subregions of the prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex plays an extremely important role in the decision making process, especially the subregions of the prefrontal cortex. So therefore, the decision making process is a cognitive, it's a neurobiological process, and it is of course a psychological process as well, because it involves risks, rewards and consequences. It's a social process simultaneously. So therefore, the decision making process is a complex one. So we come to the next idea, that is PFC and decision making. So The prefrontal cortex, short PFC, is located at the front of the human brain, and that is highlighted in red. You can see that. The prefrontal cortex plays an extremely important role in the decision-making process. The prefrontal cortex, or PFC, is responsible for long-term planning. It helps us understand rules. It also helps us calculate consequences of risk and reward. It regulates our emotions. Therefore, it performs a variety of functions. It is also responsible for problem solving and decision making. Therefore, the executive functions are carried out here. But if we experience or continue to experience anxiety, that particular experience will promptly disrupt the decision-making regions of the prefrontal cortex, and the PFC will not be able to help us with these executive functions, or stop, think, plan and act. So those executive functions, critical thinking functions, will not be activated if we are visited by a huge amount of anxiety. So therefore, it's very important that we keep this particular region free from anxiety. And how do we do that? The moment we learn how to cope with anxiety, we can take care of these things well. That brings us to the idea of the paradox of choice. As I told you, choice is a wonderful thing. We all like to have our own choices. We all want to have freedom to choose the things that we like. Choice gives us a sense of power, a sense of accomplishment, achievement, recognition. So choice is a wonderful thing to have. But then choice is also paradoxical. How much choice do you want to have? Look at the things that we perform on a daily basis, the choices that we make every day. So, for example, if I have to buy a smartphone, how many choices I have in the market? And are not these choices going to create a great amount of anxiety in me? For example, if I decide a price range for my smartphone, within that price range, I'll have several options, several choices. And then I'll begin to explore those choices, and I'll switch from one place, one device to the other. I'll seek guidance and help or support from my peers, my family members. I'll browse, I'll research the internet to help me with my decision-making process. So imagine how much time somebody is going to spend in the choice-making process of buying a smartphone. And that's the reason why it's very, very rightly said that multiple choices or several choices are paradoxical in nature. So in this case, much or more is less. So, and less is more, in fact. If you don't have many choices, you'll not have to experience as much anxiety as you will when you have many choices. So that's the difference. So this is choice paradox, or the paradox of choice, presented to you diagrammatically. So if you have multiple choices, okay, that means it will lead to problems for you. The satisfaction level will drop. So if you have less choices, that means limited choices, that's good for you. You will not experience much anxiety. Now this idea is based on a wonderful book written by Barry Schwartz, American psychologist. The title of the book is, in fact, The Paradox of Choice. Why more is less. That means if you have more choices, it is less useful. If you have less choices, that's more useful to you. Because we all know that autonomy and freedom of choice are critical to our well-being. Are critical. Otherwise, we'll feel as if we are bogged down, we are limited, we do not have freedom. So it's critical to our well-being, autonomy and freedom of choice. But at the same time, we also know that choice is critical to freedom and autonomy. So they are complementary to each other. So freedom, choice and autonomy are complementary. They are interrelated ideas. So freedom and choice and autonomy are crucial to our well-being. But the idea is more freedom and autonomy, we don't seem to be benefiting from it psychologically. That's exactly what Barry Schwartz suggests in his book. Says that we are not enjoying, we are not benefiting from more freedom and autonomy psychologically. So that means the more freedom and autonomy that we have are in fact leading to more and more anxiety for us. So this paradox of choice is one big reason for the heightened anxiety in our times. That brings us to the idea of decision-making anxiety. So decision-making process is fraught with anxiety. That's not unnatural. It's universal and natural. Because every time you know your decision will have either reward or punishment, criticism or consequences, you are bound to experience anxiety. But then, how exactly is that experience of anxiety going to affect you and your practices, your approaches? So decision-making anxiety is normal as it is universal. Everyone experiences decision-making anxiety. But a chronic and continuous experience of anxiety while making decisions is distressing. If this becomes a regularity with somebody, the person will experience anxiety on a regular basis, even while making decisions for everyday activities, everyday things, for even less important things. The person will begin to experience anxiety because it has become chronic. So decision will invite anxiety automatically. Otherwise, there are several decisions that we make in our lives that do not experience anxiety. And at times, it's also very, very subjective. It differs. For example, while picking my dresses for a certain day, I may not experience any anxiety, but there are people who experience a tremendous amount of anxiety while doing so. So it's also subjective, differs from person to person. But if it turns out to be chronic, it's going to cause trouble. Now, this problem of plenty, we have already talked about it. Problem of plenty, paradox of choice, and the fear of failure are the major causes of decision-making anxiety. The problem of plenty, if I give you multiple choices right in front of you and each of these choices appears to be viable or a viable alternative, that's definitely create, that's definitely going to create anxiety in you, because there is problem of plenty. And at the same time, it's the fear of failure. When I have equally important options or alternatives right in front of me, I will experience anxiety because I will fear the failure. If I say, what if I make this choice and I fail? What if I make that choice and I fail? So, fear of failure will loom large in my mind, and that will thwart, obstruct or hinder my decision-making process. and there's decision making anxiety and loss of intuitive power. We all have this power, the intuitive power. Sometimes we make decisions on the basis of this intuitive power. Okay, I'll go with this choice. That's what my intuition tells me, my gut feeling tells me. So if you experience decision making anxiety over a certain period of time, for a prolonged period, that will affect your intuitive power as well. And then finally, there's a difference between healthy consultation and insatiable questioning. We need to understand that. We come across people who consult everyone and everything, even for small decisions, unimportant or less important decisions. They consult everyone. They keep questioning. That's insatiable, and that's a problem. That's a clinical condition. Someone needs to understand. There's a difference between healthy consultation and insatiable questioning. Healthy consultation, that means you're serious about it, you find somebody who knows that area well, then you rely on that person's insight and experience, and then you make your decision. And you don't have to run from one place to another and for a long time and then keep questioning. So the difference between healthy consultation and insatiable questioning needs to be understood. So again, 2 coping strategies. If you remember, I talked about the same things while talking about death anxiety. I'll be bringing in this idea of coping strategies every time I am going to focus on a literary composition, just to keep you posted, just to keep you reminded. So the coping strategies we already know. So these are the intentional efforts. If I do not have that intent, I'll not make any efforts. So these are the intentional efforts that we engage in order to minimize the physical, the psychological or social harm of an event or situation. So these are intentional. Now we come back again to the same idea of problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. So at the end of our discussion of each of these literary compositions, you decide on your own whether it requires a problem-focused coping or an emotion-focused coping, because I have already talked about these 2 approaches. So let's take a quick look at the road note taken by Robert Frost and see how it struggles with decision-making anxiety, how the speaker struggles with decision-making anxiety, and how by engaging with the speaker's struggle, we can in fact derive some valuable insights. We can develop certain important coping skills and strategies that are employed successfully in this poetic composition. So, there's 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and that is going to give you a lot of anxiety because you're standing at the crossroad. You're standing at a point from where 2 roads are diverged, and you know that both the roads are equally important, are equally viable. Now that's going to embroil you in a lot of anxiety. You're going to experience anxiety for a prolonged period. I must tell you that if you do not cut your anxiety short, then you'll find yourself in a frozen zone where you will not be able to act. So these are some of the things that we'll be focusing on when I walk you through these lines and let you know how the coping skills and strategies used in this poem are going to help us a lot. So if you have read this poem, you know this well. If you haven't read this poem, you can read and try to understand its basic meaning. It's all about making a choice. Life decision, a very important life decision. So you have 2 choices. and you do not have the option to go for both. You are a single traveler, you can make just one choice. So how exactly are you going to feel then? And that's exactly what the speaker is feeling here. And when we know that this choice is going to be life altering, since it's a life decision, we are bound to experience a great amount of anxiety. And that's exactly what the speaker in this poem is also experiencing. So the speaker goes on talking about it, and the speaker does a few things. So I'll walk you through those ideas. The first thing is two roads. That means you are faced with a choice issue, paradox of choice. Imagine if you had no choice, there was just one road, you would take it and you would not suffer from that anxiety. So you have two roads now. That means there's a choice issue and you're free to make that choice. When you know that you're free to make that choice, you're bound to experience anxiety, because your freedom of choice will bring with it an idea of responsibility, the burden of responsibility. So you're going to experience anxiety. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and he expresses his inability that I could not travel both. I am a single traveler. I could not travel. I don't have that option. I am given two choices and I am asked to go for any one of those two choices. Therefore, I know that very, very well. And then, long I stood. Now, this is a very, very important coping skill that we all need to develop in us. I'll be talking about this particular coping skill after a while, but for now, you know that this is a very, very important coping skill. I don't exactly know whether you've been able to figure it out or not yet. If you have not been able to do so, I'm going to do it for you. So, long I stood. Now, go back to two roads. I cannot take both. Long I stood. You can see a certain process from finding the choices, realizing the limitations, and then doing something. And what is that something? Standing for a long time. Long I stood. And then you did not stand only. While you are standing, you're doing something. So your standing is not necessarily an inertia position. You're doing something while you are standing. And what exactly the speaker is doing? The speaker is looking down. The speaker is evaluating the options. So the process is very, very clear. You have two choices or two options. You cannot take both. You stand for a long time and then you begin to assess and evaluate your choices or options. And then we come to the next part of it. Then took the other. But before taking the other, you also evaluate the same thing. Therefore, the speaker is able to say it is just as fair, perhaps has the better claim, because it was, so you have as just as fair, having perhaps the better claim, and because now the speaker is trying to give reasons for his or her choice. The reasons for his choice, because this is a very, very important coping strategy. This is how we cope with the burden of responsibility when we give our reasons. When you do something and you know that it might lead to failure or serious consequences, you begin to give your reason for doing that, so that the failure of it will not hurt you much. And that's exactly what the speaker is also doing here, having perhaps a better claim. And then because it was grassy, so giving reasons. And then it comes back to the same question again. Both of them are equally important. It's not that one is good, the other is bad. There was no question of it at all. So equal, both of them, equally viable. And then we come to the last segment where he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh. Now this is very ambiguous, whether it's a sigh of relief or a sigh of regret, pain. We don't exactly know, but then the speaker leaves that to us. Whenever we make choices, as I have already told you, it's going to be extremely subjective. So whether it's going to be a sigh of relief or a sigh of regret is to be decided by us. I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Irrespective of what kind of difference it has made for the speaker, whether it has, given him success or failure, irrespective of that, the speaker accepts the fact that I took the one less traveled by. That was my decision, that was my choice. So when it comes to coping with anxiety, acceptance again plays a very important role. In my last lecture, while talking about Death Be Not Proud, I talked about this particular skill that works all through. So when we come to the coping skills and strategies that are used in this poem, what exactly do we get to see? We start with a calm balm. Long I stood. So whenever you are faced with a challenge, you experience the adrenaline rush that is pumped inside you, and then you experience anxiety, and then in your anxiety, if you make a choice, there is every possibility that it will go wrong. So it's always a good idea to calm yourself. So calming actually works as balming. Therefore, it's the calm balm. Long I stood. When you do not know, you are agitated, you stand for a while, relax. You may also breathe, and then you can begin to think about it. So if you forget that particular thing for a moment and then begin to think about it again, after you have relaxed, that will give you that much needed insight into that particular thing. So that's exactly what the speaker does here. That's a skill we all need to develop, and the poet tells us that this is an important skill. We also need to evaluate well, and that's exactly what the speaker does here. Whenever there is a choice question, we need to evaluate. That's exactly what the speaker does. So if I have a question in my mind, I have to evaluate it. And then imaging. So imaging is something that the speaker does extremely well in this. Starts by using lots of metaphors. Two roads are those choices or options that we have in life. So this imaging helps you come to the real question. And that's a very powerful skill, imaging skill. Opposite energy can be used in order to overcome analysis paralysis. So if you go on analyzing the same thing for a long time, it's going to have paralytic effects on you. So analysis paralysis can be avoided using opposite energy. That's exactly what the speaker does here, and that's a very important skill. Long I stood. He could have stood for an unending period, but he didn't do that. I took the one. So suddenly he switches to the action mode. So inaction, inertia mode to action mode. That's opposite energy, and that helps the speaker overcome analysis paralysis. And then action, not procrastination. We all know that that's a very important skill. Action after some moment of inaction is of course what we need. But procrastination, that particular moment of inaction, should not result in procrastination. So that's exactly what the speaker does here. So that's an important skill. And then I have already talked about it, freedom, responsibility, and acceptance. The speaker does it all. Freedom, the speaker enjoys. The speaker knows well that it will bring the burden of responsibility, and all the speaker has to do is to accept it. And that's a very, very important skill we need to develop in us, and the poetic composition tells us that. And then finally, somatic decision making. Sometimes, when the executive brain, the logical approach doesn't work, we can focus on somatic decision making skills, and we allow our emotional side to do it for us. And that's exactly what the speaker does this, and that's the reason why he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh, ages and ages hence. Why should he tell this with a sigh? A sigh of relief or a sigh of grief or regret? That's going to be an emotional affair after all. So this somatic decision making is also used as an important skill in this poetic composition. And that's how we come to the end of this lecture. I'm sure you have liked the ideas that I talked about. In the meanwhile, you can also explore a variety of other poems to discover the coping skills and strategies contained in those poetic compositions, and thus enrich your idea of these concepts. So thank you very much for joining me.